Try to think to at least one painting from 17th to 18th century of European art where the man is crying. Not a saint person, not a Christ on a cross, just a man in an everyday scene with tears. Hard to think about one, right? That's not a coincidence, and today we are going to look at what's behind that absence and why Greuze's diptych is a rare exception that actually explains it. This is The Ungrateful Son, 1777, the Louvre. Young man is leaving home to join the army, but against his family's will. His father on the left is cursing him. His mother and sisters are begging him to stay. His face doesn't show triumph. You can see the pain of a decision his family does not understand, but he goes. The second painting, The Punished Son, 1778. The same room a few years later. The same son has come back home from war with a wound. He has dropped his cane, but his father lies in a bed, dying. And here, for the first time in the diptych, the man is crying. The son grabs his head and his chest, his whole body folding under the weight of grief. The physical wound doesn't matter anymore. He came too late. And as a historian of emotions, we have one question. What does this image tell us about the male tears and 18th century of European culture? To understand why this image is so rare, we need some historical context. Johann Huizinga, the waning of the Middle Ages, he describes a culture where tears were considered fine and honorable. Weeping was a sign of genuine feeling, public, collective, and socially approved. But, and this is a key point, this weeping existed within very specific context: religious devotion, mourning, and solemn ritual. Outside of these frames, especially for men in everyday life, tears disappear. This is exactly where William's ready concept of emotional regime becomes useful. Every era creates its own set of norms. Which emotions are acceptable, for whom, and in what context? The medieval regime allowed public weeping, but within sacred and ritual frameworks. By the 17th century, male restraint becomes the norm in secular life. 18th century sentimentalism creates a new but really narrow emotional regime. In it, the capacity to feel deeply is a virtue. But for men, it doesn't allow them to cry whenever they want. The regime still requires a moral narrative. For male tears to be acceptable, there has to be a real story of guilt and loss behind it. This is why diptych makes more sense here than a single painting. It's more powerful, more complete. Without the first painting, without the leaving, the guilt, the rupture, the second one doesn't fully land. The emotional regime only opens the door to tears once the story has been told. The mechanics of this justification was described precisely by Adam Smith in the theory of moral sentiments. For Smith, sympathy is not automatic. It's a judgment and assessment. The observer asks whether the emotion is appropriate for the situation. Smith writes that the capacity to feel deeply for others is a mark of moral perfection. But he also warns an excessive display of grief pushes people away. This is where the diptych as a form becomes crucial. Greuze gives the viewer the full story. We know who this man is, what he did, and what it cost him. That knowledge is what makes his tears make sense to us. Sympathy becomes not just because man is crying, but because we know why. That's the proof that this man has moral conscience. And that, for Smith, is exactly what makes him worthy for our sympathy. So, what does this diptych show us about European views on male tears? It shows us that 1770s were a rare window in history of European painting, a moment where a male tears could be shown as simply human. Not sacred, not heroic, just human. That became possible because sentimentalism created an emotional regime where man's capacity to grieve could be read as a sign of moral depth rather than weakness. But even within this window, the right to tears should be earned. It took two paintings, not only one. It took a whole story of a guilt and consequences. And that necessity, the necessity of earning the right for your own pain, is precisely what 18th century European culture believed about male tears.